My pastor that we have so many less problems with the Bible when we simply let it say what it says. It doesn't require an IQ of 250. It doesn't require an IQ of 300. It just simply requires the honesty to sit down, look at this book, read what it has to say, and then believe it. And we take it literally, like we would any other book. May our time together now be profitable, we ask for in our Savior's name. Amen. You know, I'm convinced, one of my concerns is, as I look at some of these things, is I'm convinced that most people don't even read the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. Now, I have to admit, there are places in the Old Testament that kind of drag. Leviticus is tough reading, especially there's a section I don't care for when it gets into leprosy and all the regulations concerning that. I don't like that. And then you have in First Chronicles, the first 9 chapters in First Chronicles are all just genealogy. And then in Ezekiel, from chapters 40 through 48, you have the description of Ezekiel's millennial temple. And I have a map, I think I put it on the church website. You can find it in my file on the church website. It shows you a description of how the temple was laid out. And I was just so delighted. I practically jumped through the roof when I saw that because I had never understood that. How many times I read through that passage. And so I think a lot of times people just don't read the Old Testament because there are things there that are complicated, and it's just English. Some of the places in the Old Testament, the English could be a little bit better translated, and that's where some of our more modern English translations are a little bit of help. If you really want to read the Old Testament, my recommendation would be consider reading it in the New King James or in one of the other modern translations. The New King James is pretty good. I like that. It's pretty reliable. It's based on the King James, so it's pretty good in most places, and it'll make it a little easier to read. Anyway, we have got a lot of territory to cover. Tonight we're going to cover 2 Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now that's a lot of territory to cover. It's a lot of history. Now 2 Kings is a fascinating book because it is going to begin uniquely at a time when things are really beginning to change. You have an interesting note that starts off. The first chapter, the first verse tells you that the kingdom of Moab rebelled. Now, King David had taken Moab, and he had subdued Moab, Edom, Syria, all of the nations around him, and he put garrisons of soldiers there. And so over time, as you get into Kings and Chronicles, you're going to see both the southern and the northern kingdom, their power is going to wane and diminish, and they're going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so at this point, as it opens, this is about 852 BC, we do know this from history, that Moab revolted and successfully got out from under the authority. So 2 Kings is going to cover the history of from 852 BC right down to the final death cries of the northern kingdom in 722 BC, and also it's going to follow all the way down to 586 and the destruction of Jerusalem. Now Jerusalem actually is going to be invaded in 597, but it's not going to be destroyed. It's going to have a vassal king. Zedekiah, the last king, is put up as a vassal who decides to revolt, and because he will not repent, he will not surrender, the city gets leveled and the temple gets burned. And that's going to be all the way to the end of 2 Chronicles there. So you have a lot of fascinating history. Now, the story of 2 Kings opens up in a rather odd way. The king of the northern kingdom, Azariah, was sick, and he was concerned about his health. Now, we're not going to go there and read it, but you could read it in 2 Kings chapter 1. And this is, somebody said some of this was a soap opera, and you're not kidding. This 2 Kings is really a soap opera in a lot of places because you're going to see a lot of things that just don't make any sense. And this is the first one. He sends to Ekron, which is a city of the Philistines, and he sends messengers there to go and inquire of their god Beelzebub. Now that's if you've ever heard, Beelzebub was one of the names that was given to Satan, and it was a god in that time. In Ekron, it was a god of one of the Philistines. Another one was Dagon, but Ekron, their god, was Beelzebub. So here, this king of the northern kingdom, he's not inquiring of Jehovah. He sends messengers to go to the Gath, or rather Ekron, over in the land of the Philistines, and find out from one of the prophets of Beelzebub. Well, what happens is really fascinating because old Mr. Elijah, who's getting up in years, intercepts the messengers, and he stops them in their tracks. And he says, you go tell that guy, Hezekiah was the king. You go tell him. He says, you think there's not a God in Israel anymore, do you? He said, you're going to die. And he sent them back. And so the king was upset. And the chapter, you talk about something unusual. If you read the first chapter of 2 Kings, 3 times a battalion of men, 50 men and their captain, come down to take Elijah. Now, they were summoning him to the king. Ahaziah wanted to see him, not to have tea with him, not to have coffee with him. He was going to arrest him, because we know, and there's plenty of evidence that these men were not well thought of and not treated too terribly well. You can find, for example, in 2 Kings 1:9, you might make a note of this, and in 2 Kings 1:9, you find out that this man Elijah had been harassed, and they wanted to get him. And other places, you find 1 Kings 18, you'll find that Ahaz sought Elijah, and he was trying to get him, and he was not favorable, because he said, Obadiah, the servant of King Ahab, said, there's no land around where the king hasn't sent somebody to find you. And it wasn't for friendly things. So 50 men come down, and if you remember the story, it's fascinating. They come and say, man of God, come down. And so Elijah's sitting on top of a hill and says, if I'm a man of God, let fire fall from heaven and consume you. Twice, 100 men get fried. And finally, the third captain comes up and begs him, says, would you please come down? Let my life be dear to you. And so Elijah goes back with him to see the king. And the king subsequently dies. So it's quite a story when you get down to that. You have so much of that going on. Now, one thing that we didn't mention is that back in 1 Kings, at the end of 1 Kings, in the 22nd chapter, Jehoshaphat made peace with Ahab. What we might not have kept in mind, what you might not realize, is a good part of the time, from the time they defected under Rehoboam, right up to the time of Jehoshaphat, for a number of years, they were fighting back and forth with each other. The two nations were fighting. Now, wait a minute, they're all Jews, but they're fighting like they're enemies, and they were enemies. I mean, it was just the strangest thing. But so Jehoshaphat makes peace with them, and pretty much that stays that way until the northern kingdom goes. But for quite a while, they were at odds with each other, and that doesn't make sense to me. But that's the way it was. Then in the second chapter, you have a fascinating story. Who remembers what happened to Elijah? How did Elijah leave? He took Elisha with him and said, "Now I'm going to." He says, "You stay here, and I'm going to go on to such and such a place." And Elisha wouldn't leave him, because Elisha knew that Elijah was going to leave him that day. He was going to die. How did Elijah go, by the way? Does anybody remember? It's in 2 Kings chapter 2. Remember the chariot of fire? Well, you know what? Everybody, let's go to 2 Kings chapter 2. You got to see this with your eyes, because this is one of those many places where people, Pastor, they can't read English. They really can't. And I keep saying that, and I'm glad you picked up on that when I said it, because I really believe that's the problem. But in 2 Kings chapter 2, how many people have you heard of the chariot, somebody going up the chariot and fire? What was that old gospel song they had, that old, that had about the chariot?
Swing low, sweet chariot.
Swing low, sweet chariot. There you go. That's it. Coming forward to carry me home. Well, I think now that reflects what people think. Now, if you go to 2 Kings chapter 2, is that what happened? Now, this was really a fascinating story, because among the things that are going on here, if you read through here, you'll find that Elisha wanted to have a double portion of the Spirit that Elijah had. And as a result of, and he was told, if you see how I depart from you, God will grant that to you. And so he did see how he departed. And so Elisha wound up doing twice as many miracles as Elijah did. But now, what happens? Okay. Let's begin reading back at verse 8, 2 Kings chapter 2. And Elijah took his mantle and wrapped it together and smote the waters, and they were divided hither and thither, so the two went over on dry ground. That's the Jordan River. And it came to pass, when they had gone over, that Elijah said unto Elisha, Ask what I shall do to thee before I be taken away from thee. Now, he hadn't said it to this point, but Elisha knew. He had heard from other people that Elijah was leaving. So now Elijah tells him, okay, I'm going to leave you. And Elisha said, I pray thee, let a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. And he's going to wind up and get that because he's going to do twice as many miracles as Elijah did. But so, verse 10, he said, and you have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from thee, it shall be so unto thee. But if not, it shall not be so. Now, notice what happens. And it came to pass, as they went on and talked, that behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them asunder. And Elijah went up in a chariot of fire. What does it say? And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. Swing low, sweet chariot. There's another sacred cow that got butchered. Good price on steaks this week at the sacred cow market. It's really interesting, though, that so much of religious tradition does things like this. You know, there's little things along the way, like, you know, one time I did this, and I kind of wished afterwards I hadn't done it. When I was pastoring, I pointed out that Hark the Herald Angels Sing, and I took them over to Luke 2, and it says they don't sing. I just ruined a good gospel. I just ruined a good hymn. Hark the herald angels speak. Well, you can make it fit, but it wasn't popular. But there's so much religious tradition. Here's another one of them. So Elijah went up in a whirlwind, and Elisha saw, and in verse 12, and Elisha saw, and he cried, my father, the chariot of Israel and the horsemen thereof, and he saw him no more. And he took hold of his own clothes and rent them in two pieces. So he did watch and see. What was the chariot of fire then? If Elijah went up in a whirlwind, what was the chariot of fire for? Why was that there? It was there as a test to see if Elisha would actually do what he had to do. He would actually watch and see. Would he really pay attention to what he should be paying attention to? Or would he be caught by the fascination? You know, Pastor, I could see here, you could allegorize this and make a wonderful sermon out of this, keeping your eyes on the right thing. Because the flashy thing is a chariot of fire goes through it. I mean, I would have loved to have seen a chariot of fire. If I had been there, I know I would have never seen Elijah. I would have been watching the chariot of fire. I said, man, I want one of those. This is an interesting way for a man's life to end. And so Elijah, you know, he's done a lot of things. You go back in 1 King and his time with Ahab and his exchange with Ahab. It's funny. It's almost funny because when Ahab meets him after a while and he says, is that you, O troubler of Israel? And Elijah says to him, he says, it's not me that's troubling Israel. It's almost, in a way, it's almost comical. And Ahab, we're not back in 1 Kings, but Ahab is kind of a funny guy in some ways. He does some things that almost make sense. But most of what he does doesn't make sense. But he almost made sense a few times. Now, so moving on from that point, and you have also another story in here that really is a fascinating story. Naaman the Syrian, he was the leader of, you find this in chapter 5, Naaman the Syrian is going to be healed of his leprosy. Now, he came, the story is funny. This is like a good TV program. He sent money, or he sent an ambassador. He sent an assembly, he sent a group of counselors to see the king of Israel, the northern kingdom. And he had heard that there was a prophet who could heal. And so here the poor king of Israel said, what am I going to do? Syria wants to fight. They want to fight. They want to precipitate a war, because he said, I can't do this. And so Elisha was the one that heard about it. And so he had this man, Naaman, come down. And he told him to dip in the river of Jordan 7 times. And of course, if you read the story, Naaman was just furious at that. Because Elisha not only didn't come out himself, he sent out a servant, and he also told him something like, and Naaman was looking for him to come out and say some magical words and do something and zap and take his leprosy away. He wasn't happy, but he subsequently did it. Now, what is interesting about that is when a couple chapters later, guess what you find out? Samaria, the northern kingdom, was besieged by Syria. Who was the captain of Syria's army that was a leper and had been healed? Naaman. Isn't that kind of strange? Now, I wonder how that fits together. Naaman was the captain of the army, and a couple chapters later, he is the one that leads, I believe he's the one that leads the army, and they besiege Samaria, and they do some damage to it. So it's really kind of a strange story in a way. But so Samaria is besieged, and in the 6th chapter, there's another story there's just so many stories in here that are interesting. Is that Elisha predicted there would be food. They were besieged and the city was starving. And if you look at it, the city was starving and God did something. The Syrian army heard somebody coming, a big army. And so they ran and left their tents. They left everything there. And here these lepers go out and they find all this food and they're eating and gorging themselves. And they say, we're doing the wrong thing, guys. So they sent word into the city. And lo and behold, Elisha had made a prophecy that food would be very cheap, and he gave some prices on things, and the next day it happened. They were starving. They were held in a siege. That was a popular way of warfare back in those days. If you surrounded a city, you could sit there if it was a walled city, and you could try and go over it. You could try and knock it down. You could do this, or you could simply block it off and wait for the people to start starving. That's what happened to Jerusalem. It took 2 years for Nebuchadnezzar to do it, but in 2 years, Nebuchadnezzar starved the people out of Jerusalem. It's a very common way to do it. So that's what they were doing up here, and the Syrians were doing. And despite the fact, God did something unusual. And you find that a couple of times that you're going to find it in historical books. You're going to find a little bit later that God's going to come through and kill 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in the night. Now, can you imagine that? That's going to be for Hezekiah. That's going to be later. But there's some interesting things God does here. They heard the sound of soldiers, and they just took off and left. And you can read that in the 6th chapter. So there's so much fun stuff here. Now, in Judah, after Jehoshaphat passed away, Jehoshaphat was a good king. He was one of the good kings. And when you go through and look at the chronology of the kings, and I'm going to I started to make up a list, but I had a problem with it. I left off the references. And if I go through and look at the southern kingdom, this is the better kingdom. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 men that were righteous kings. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 that were wicked. So it's not as good a ratio as it could be. 8 good, 12 bad, and some of the bad ones were really bad. So we have this next king that comes along. He's a wicked king, and he only ruled for 8 years. Now, what happens to Jehoram, the king, it's really kind of funny. He goes up to visit the king of the northern kingdom, and the strangest thing happens. And this makes me wonder, Pastor, if you weren't right about something you suggested. Because Elisha sends one of the prophets to anoint a man named Jehu. They anoint him. He's a general in the army in the northern kingdom of Israel. And he anoints him to be king. And he goes and kills the son of Ahab that's on the throne, and he takes out all of Ahab's descendants, which God told him to do because of what Ahab had done. So Ahab has 70 sons. They're all beheaded. You talk about that's a real story. But in the process, this king of the southern kingdom, Jehoram, went up to see King Joram, who was a son of Ahab. And once he was anointed king, Jehu went to battle, and he killed both the king of the northern kingdom, and he got the king of the southern kingdom. He killed both of those kings. Now, it makes me wonder, because he was anointed king, and the first thing Jehu did is he went out and he got Jehoram. You have to be careful with these names. There's Jehoram, and there's Joram. And so Joram was the northern king, Jehoram was the southern king. So you can check in my notes here. You can see that it's in here, and it gets to be kind of a tricky thing. Those names really are. Then you get later on. There's Jehoiachin, Jehoiakim. There's a whole bunch of names like that. The guy with the chin, I always remember him. Jehoiachin. He was the one, by the way, we'll see later. He was the one who was so bad that God said, none of your seed will ever sit on the throne anymore in Israel. And that becomes important, because guess who is a distant descendant of Jehoiachin? He's of the tribe of Judah, Joseph, the so-called father of Jesus. He was a direct descendant. So if he had been the natural father of Jesus, the curse of Jehoiachin would have passed on Christ, and he could have not been king. But Mary came from the line of another, came through the son Nathan, one of David's other sons, Nathan, and his bloodline, that didn't sit on the throne. But he could have sat on the throne because he was kingly line. And so Christ's physical descendants came from David through Nathan. And rather Joseph, His came from David through Solomon, all the way down to Jehoiachin, and that was the end of the line. Now, it makes you wonder when we get to the end, and this is out of the Gospels, but when you have Mary and Joseph together, then it looks like that line is canceled out too. So there could be nobody born that could claim the kingly line of David because they've been crossed over. Interesting little tidbit there. But anyway, that doesn't tell us about the Old Testament too much. So Jehu goes and he does the job. Now, Jehu cleans house. And this is where the story even gets worse, because Jehu kills the king of the southern kingdom. He's 22 years old. He's only been on the throne. He rules for 8 years when he starts. And he gets killed at about age 30. So he doesn't probably have too many children to succeed him. As it turns out, he does have a son who's 1 year old at the time. But here's where it really gets bad. His mother, Athaliah. You talk about the wicked queen Athaliah. Before any one of the other royal seed, now there was other royal seed, remember, the line of David was not just through one person. Solomon's line was the one that was on the throne, but there was also Nathan's line, and there were individuals there that were considered royal seed. They could have, in the event that something happened to Ahaziah like it did, one of them could have stepped in and rightfully been king without any problem at all. The people would have accepted him. But what did Athaliah do? Well, we find out that she killed all of the seed royal. All of them. She killed all of them. And she ruled for 6 years. Now, what is really unbelievable is that it would have been her grandson that she killed. But there was one child, Joash, who was 1 year old, that his sister took out and hid in the temple. They went to the temple, it says, in the house of the Lord. So these stories are fascinating. You can read about this here. This is all actual history that really happened. They hid in the house of the temple for 6 years until at age 7, a priest named Jehoiada, who is a really fascinating man. By the way, you talk about old age. Jehoiada the priest lived to be 130 in the Old Testament. He lived to be 130, and he was the mentor of Joash. So he was the one that got Joash. So Joash at age 7 becomes the king. And Athaliah is killed. And it's interesting that if you go to, and you can make a note of this in 2 Kings 11, 16 and 20, it says the city was happy when she got killed. There was peace. They were at peace because she was gone. She was a wicked queen. But what I can't understand is she not only killed the seed royal, but if I don't know whether or not Ahaziah had any other sons besides Joash, but if she had found Joash, she would have killed him. She killed everybody else. She would have killed him if she could have. A grandmother? I mean, some of us here. Well, we have some grandmothers here. You imagine killing your own grandchild for something? How would you do something like that? Truth is stranger than fiction, folks. It really is, especially when you get in the Old Testament. It really is. So Athaliah is killed, and Joash was on the throne 40 years. But now there's something about Joash that's kind of sad. Joash, if you read back in 2 Kings, you'll find in his history, and you can follow it in his notes. He is, he's only mentioned for a brief period of time, but he was righteous as long as Jehoiada was alive to guide him. Jehoiada was quite a man. He was in the Old Testament, he's probably one of the greater people that ever was, and yet nobody's ever heard of him. But he made Joash toe the mark, and when Jehoiada died, Joash kind of forgot about that, and all of a sudden now he became wicked. So he's listed as being a righteous king, but toward the end of his life, it's like, no, I don't think so much so. He really probably was only righteous because he was pushed into it. And he did right. It looks like he did right, but you'll find out some of them, you'll say, like they're going to say about one a little bit later, Amaziah, that he did what was right, but not with a loyal heart. And you'll find out why in 2 Chronicles, why there's some of these men, even though they're listed as being good, so there's 8 men that were listed as being good kings. Of that, at least 2 more of them I can think of were maybe good, but not so good. And even Solomon at the end of his life was not so good. And so the ones that were really good, you start to whittle down and you find out there's just going to be a couple. Hezekiah, Jehoshaphat, Josiah, And then all of a sudden you say, well, there's David, and you get pretty thin after that, folks. There weren't very many righteous kings. God put up with a lot of wickedness in that nation of Israel. So, anyway, as we go down through here, there are some bright spots in this. By chapter 17 in here, the northern kingdom fell in the 17th chapter, and you have a summary of why. And if you want to know exactly why, very concisely in 2 Kings 17, verses 7 and following will tell you precisely why they fell, because those people, they never even seriously kept the law. And by the way, we shouldn't forget about him. The man named Jehu is an interesting one. He was the anointed king. He was the one that was anointed, and he was charged with getting rid of anything related to Ahab, any of his family, any of his relatives, everything. And he took out, Ahab had 70 sons, and they were all beheaded at the insistence of Jehu. And God gave Jehu a chance to do what was right. And I wonder about Jehu, because let's go to 2 Kings chapter 10 for a moment. I wonder about him because I always had just written him off as being a nobody, but looking at him again, I wonder if there was a possibility that maybe he wasn't so bad, but maybe he just was missing something. Well, so let's begin reading it. Let's go to verse 28 and start there. Thus Jehu destroyed Baal out of Israel. Now, Jehu got rid of all the worshippers of Baal, along with getting rid of all of the seed of Ahab. I should have mentioned that, but Baal worship was gone. But they still had the golden calves that Jeroboam set up. And they had Baal beside that. So now he's going to get rid of the Baal worship. And so that does happen. Thus Jehu destroyed Baal out of Israel. Howbeit, from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, Jehu departed not after them, to wit the golden calves that were at Bethel and Dan. And the Lord said unto Jehu, because you've done well in executing that which is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab according to what was in my heart, and your children of the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. But Jehu took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord with all his heart. There's an interesting statement there. With all his heart. Now it says he took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord with all his heart, for he departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, which made Israel to sin. He didn't walk in the law of the Lord with all his heart. It makes it sound like just maybe this man actually was a believer. But he just didn't take the law seriously. I don't know. But so when you're looking at the kings of northern Israel, this is the only possibility that one of the kings of the northern end of the kingdom of Israel, this is the only possibility that this might have been a man that was almost righteous. Almost righteous. But it says he didn't take heed with all his heart. He didn't do it. Now, it doesn't, you notice it says he took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord with all his heart. But it doesn't say he didn't walk in the law of the Lord. It says he didn't take heed to walk in the Lord with all his heart. So he may have walked in it sometimes. I can't, with Jehu, I can't say. I'll have to say that he might have been a better man than I always thought he was. I always thought he was kind of a flake. I mean, he did something that was right. God says, you get your children to the fourth generation will sit on the throne. Well, now, what if he had decided to follow God with all his heart? Do you think there could have been something different? Because if you remember what God told Solomon, if you follow me with all your heart, and your children follow me, he said, you will not have a man, and you will not fail to have a man sit on the throne. Could Jehu have done the same thing? I don't know. It makes you wonder. Now, I can't answer that. I raise that question because when you read the Old Testament, stop and look at things and ask questions, because even if you can't get an answer all the time, you'll become really acquainted with Scripture and you realize that God was very powerful and God gave this man a chance. And there were some people back here that dropped the ball. Jeroboam was the other one that dropped the ball big time. He was told he could have a throne and a lineage, and he chose not to take it. And I think Jehu, I think, was also close to getting that same kind of a promise. But he didn't take it. Sad thing. Well, so in the 17th chapter, the northern kingdom is gone. But in the 18th chapter, now we have Hezekiah on the throne. And Hezekiah in the 18th chapter, just take a quick look there. This is something, it's in Scripture. You know, I always thought that David was probably the most righteous king, except for Bathsheba in Israel. But you know, there's two men that probably surpassed him. Here's one of them. Let's read what it says in chapter 18, verses 3 through 6. It's talking about Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, the king of Judah. Now, we skipped over some of the kings, but Ahaz was one of the dud kings of the southern kingdom. He was no good, but his son, at 25, came to the throne. He reigned 29 years. It says, verse 3, and he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that David his father did. Now, you notice, according to all that David his father did. Others didn't say, it didn't say that about other kings. It just said they might have done right in the Lord. He said he did right according to all his father David did. He removed the high places, brake the images, cut down the groves, and broke in pieces the brazen serpent that Moses made for the children of Israel. For until those days, the children of Israel did burn incense to it and called it Nehushtan. Do you remember that bronze serpent in the wilderness that Moses put up? And when the people were bit by the snakes, they went and looked at it and they lived? Did you know it was still around for a couple hundred years later, to the time of Hezekiah? And they were burning incense to it? Talk about, Pastor, these people were idolaters. They'd make an idol out of everything. Doesn't it say in the book of Acts, did Stephen say in his famous address, that as according to the number of your cities, so were your gods, O Israel? That you can see how that happened. It's like this snake that was up on a pole. It was a god. They were burning incense. Well, he got rid of that. Now, notice what it says in verse 5. He trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that there was none like him after him among all the kings of Judah, nor any that went before him. For he clave to the Lord and departed not from following him, but kept his commandments, which the Lord had commanded Moses. Now you notice what it says? There was none like him after him, and there was none like him before him. Who was before him? Well, Solomon and a whole bunch of other kings, but what about David? Well, you know, this man didn't do anything like Bathsheba. Was he more righteous than David? Well, it says there was none, verse 5, there was none like him among the kings of Judah, nor any that were before him. I think that includes David. Hezekiah may have been the most, according to this, may have been the most righteous king that there was. And he has he's remarkable, if you remember his remarkable existence, or rather, his remarkable deliverance. That's better. You have the Assyrians came down. Now Assyria took away the northern kingdom. The northern 10 tribes Assyria took away in 722. And about the time Hezekiah is getting onto the throne, the northern kingdom is being taken away. And so the Assyrians come down and they're going to come against him. And there's quite a bit of information here. Isaiah even has a little bit about this too. But one of their leaders called Rabshakeh comes out and he talks to people and says, you people have had it. He says, don't let Hezekiah fool you and say that God's going to deliver you, because look at the gods of all these other nations. They didn't get delivered by their gods, did they? And this is the story where, and I think it's kind of comical, because it says they woke up and they were dead men. It makes it sound like the men woke up in the morning and said, hey, we're all dead. 185,000 men we find and you can find this in the 19th chapter. 185,000 men are going to be killed. These are soldiers that came. So here comes the Assyrians. They have just taken the northern kingdom and swept it away. And the northern kingdom, by the way, was still bigger than the southern kingdom. Because the southern kingdom was only Judah and Benjamin, the northern kingdom was comprised of the 10 tribes of Judah, or 10 tribes of Israel rather. So it would have been a small thing for them to come down and just roll right through the Jerusalem. But they didn't do it. And you'll notice this in verse 35 of the 19th chapter. It says, it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out into the camp and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they rose in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. Now I could just see that, Pastor. They got more and said, hey guys, we're in trouble. We're all dead. Now what do we do? It always has amused me how that was stated. And of course, then Sennacherib, that was the king who was leading the army, went back home, and two of his sons slayed him, killed him when he was in his temple worshiping. Now, Hezekiah was a great man, but you know, the one thing that was sad about him was that he was sick, and he prayed to God, and God restored him, if you remember the story. But now, he did something after that that's kind of not too good. The king of, at that time, the king of Babylon sent down some emissaries to celebrate with the king that he was healed. Now, I kind of wonder if those emissaries that came all the way down off the Fertile Crescent, all the way down there, what were they doing down there? Were they coming down there to pat that king on the back? I don't think so, because at that point, Babylon was beginning to become a power to be reckoned with. And it wouldn't be too many years, not too many years, until they were down visiting again on a less friendly term. Well, their emissaries the next time would be Nebuchadnezzar and his people, and they were not very friendly at all. But what happened was they came, and Hezekiah, he had a little bit of pride. Now, he was a rich man, and God had blessed everything he did, and he was very righteous. But you know what? He had feet of clay, just like everybody else. His pride lifted up. He showed them everything he had in his kingdom. Everything. And so the prophet Isaiah came and said, what did these men come to see you for, and where were they from, and what did you show them? And so, of course, Hezekiah told them, and he said, yep, he said, every one of those and all your riches and all your children are going to get carried away. So Hezekiah said, He says, well, the word of the Lord is good. There'll be peace in my day. It's kind of an ironic thing that he says that. If you look at it, it's in the, let's see, what chapter is that in? Let's see, it would be in, I was just looking at that, now I don't remember the chapter. But he does say that.
It's in 20.
Chapter 20, probably chapter 20, let's see.
11, 12.
Okay, yeah. I should have written it down, but I trusted my memory, Pastor, and I have the same kind of memory you did. I have a great memory. It's just real short. So it's in chapter 20. Let's see. Okay, yeah, let's see. Okay, and so, let's see. Oh, verse 19, there it is. Yeah, 20, verse 19. And Hezekiah said unto Isaiah, good is the word of the Lord which you've spoken unto me. Is it not good if peace and truth be in my days? So at least he's happy it's going to be in his days. It's kind of a, I don't know how to take that. I mean, it sounds kind of like, well, whew, I don't have to worry. I don't know if that's what it was to be taken as. But, so now Nebuchadnezzar is going to come down. As we get later in this book, we find out that the last kings of Israel were all going to be wicked kings. And as we get down in 2 Kings, we're going to find out that, oh boy, we get down here, and you know the funniest thing of all, and it's not really funny, probably the most righteous king was the father of definitely the most wicked king, because Hezekiah's son Manasseh was the most wicked king of the whole bunch. He was terrible. We find out in Scripture, you find out that it's said of him that because of what he did, the judgment was certain. Up to this point, when God sent prophets to the southern kingdom and prophesied gloom and doom unless they repented, there was a chance that they could escape. After Manasseh was on the throne, God said, it's just a matter of time. Just a matter of time. Manasseh, so of all things, isn't that strange, kind of a strange thing? You talk about like a soap opera, the most righteous king of all, followed by his son, the most wicked king of all. And the most wicked king of all, the terrible thing is, Manasseh had the longest reign of anybody in the southern kingdom, 55 years. The next low, there was somebody who had a 52-year reign. It was basically a good king, but Manasseh was not a good king. And it said he just filled the city with blood. And he was a terrible king. And so he's going to pretty much end everything. Now, you do find out that after him there comes another king named Ammon, but now we find one last bright spot, King Josiah. Josiah was a good king. He got on the throne when he was 7 years old. He was there for 8 years old rather, and he was there for 31 years. And he did a lot of things right. Now, I just kind of wish that I had more time on this, but we find that he did everything right except he went out to battle when he shouldn't have. Pharaoh was coming up to fight somebody, and he went out against him for whatever reason. I don't know. It's not really detailed in Scripture, and so he wound up getting killed. He ruled 31 years. He was 8 years old. He could have ruled 50-some-odd years. He could have done a lot of good, but he was killed, and he was greatly mourned. Greatly mourned, more than most people. So, what happens? Well, after Josiah's time, After he's dead, then the Pharaoh is going to put on the throne Jehoiakim, who is going to be basically not a very good king. And then that's followed by Jehoiachin, who's the one that got the curse. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to take him out and replace him with somebody named Zedekiah. Zedekiah is on the throne for 11 years. So in 597, Nebuchadnezzar comes down and takes Jehoiachin out. It's the first successful. He took the city. He didn't do anything to it. He took the king out. He took a bunch of the wealth. He took some of the best people, the craftsmen and everything. You can read about it back there. And he put Zedekiah on the throne. And for 9 years, Zedekiah paid tribute to him as a vassal. And then in the 9th year of his reign, he revolted and refused to do it. And Nebuchadnezzar came up and starved him out in 2 years. And that was the end of the kingdom. So when you get through 2 Kings, you have gone through the whole kingdom. But now you come to Chronicles, and you say, oh, now wait a minute here. We're going back over history again? Well, the difference between Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Samuel, there's one simple difference. Chronicles is only about the kings of Judah. After you have David and Solomon, Rehoboam, but then the kingdom splits it. If you remember, the kingdom split at the time of Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. He was a fool, and he wanted to raise the taxes. After the people begged him to lower them, he said he was going to raise them. So he lost 10 tribes, and so it follows Rehoboam and then all of Rehoboam's seed. So it follows only the kings of the southern kingdom. So if you want to know about the kings of the northern kingdom, you have to read Kings. You have to read 1st and 2nd Kings to find out about them. And there's not a lot said about them. We didn't mention much about them, but if you go through and look at them, believe me, there isn't much to say about them. They were killing each other. There was one that ruled for 3 days, and they were killing each other off, was assassinations. Television's got nothing on those people. Like I said, that book is a soap opera. If you read through the 2nd Kings, you have seen a real honest-to-goodness, historically accurate soap opera. People killing each other off and the stuff that happened. Makes you wonder why God put up with some of that. Yep. So we come to 1st Chronicles then. So 1st Chronicles, it's a different kind of book. If you read 1st Chronicles, the first 9 chapters kind of will really kind of wear you out because it's just genealogy. It goes through an extensive genealogy. I mean, it gets more genealogy than you ever thought you'd ever want to know. Now, for us today, of course, that genealogy is probably meaningless. But I dare say when it was written, it was important to those people because they had to know their lineage. Because remember, when it talks about, you read in the Old Testament, it talks about the inheritance, and you'll see it in the Psalms, it talks about their inheritance. What are they talking about? They're talking about their home in heaven? No, they're talking about the piece of land on the ground that was theirs. They were to inherit a piece of the earth. They were given a plot of land that was theirs. That was their inheritance. And so you needed to know your family lineage to know where was your piece of real estate? Where was yours? It was yours. So where is it? Whose family are you from? They had to know. So the genealogical records in the first 9 chapters in 1st Chronicles are not important to us, but they sure were to the people of Israel. And if you read through them, I've read through them. Every time we go through them, and I sat there and we kind of sit there and try to keep awake and can really get to you. But you actually find out there's some interesting things said about there's a few interesting facts in there that you can read if you want to, but we're not going to touch on it. So really, 1st Chronicles becomes the history of King David's reign. Now I put in your notes, this is on page 12 on our outline, that many believers wonder why the Bible contains both Kings and Chronicles. However, 1st and 2nd Chronicles is not a duplication of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. It records in greater detail the reigns of the kings of Judah only, but contains nothing about the northern kingdom. So as I said, if you want to know about the northern kingdom and Jehu and those, you have to read 1st and 2nd Kings, and that's where you'll find what's there to be said about them. So now, when you get into 1st Chronicles, it's all about David. And it starts off talking about David. The first real event that stands out is that the book really begins primarily with the death of Saul. It's kind of a strange way to begin, but you find out in the 10th chapter, Saul is killed in battle, and his sons are killed. And so David becomes king of Hebron for 7 years and a half, and then all Israel comes to him, and he becomes king. And so you wind up having this man on the throne. Skip the page here. Should follow my own notes. There we go. There's where it should be. And so you find out that, let's see, history begins with him. Now, most of the history of David, one of the things that you'll find as you read through Chronicles, it's a little bit different than Kings because it almost sounds like he's compiling statistics and giving you facts and figures and so forth. And it's not what you'd call exciting reading. So you have a lot of things in here. For example, you'll notice I put in your outline, you have the list of his mighty men. And King David had some mighty men. Some of those guys were really something. One of them, his most mighty man, stood against 800 men by himself and slew them. Now, I dare say with a sword or a spear, fighting 800 people that also were armed the same way, and you have just a shield and a sword and spear or whatever, and you kill 800 of them, I would say that would qualify as a mighty man. And so David had several men that were like that. And one of them said he stationed himself in the middle of a field of lentils, and he was cutting down the enemy until he was there so long he couldn't get the sword out of his hand. His hand was just like it was welded to the sword. And he stayed there. And you can read about that. There's some really fascinating stuff. I mean, this is good material for, if you want a good story and you enjoy good history, you're going to get it back here in some of these places. And so you have his mighty men, and you have his first attempt to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Now remember, King David did not build the temple, but he wanted to bring the Ark to Jerusalem. And so when he tried to bring it to Jerusalem, a very unfortunate event happened. Two men were taking the cart, the Ark of the Covenant was on it, and it slipped, and one of them reached out and touched it. Bam! He was zapped, and King David got upset, and they said, "That's it." They stopped right there. And the ark stayed 7 months in somebody's house, and the guy got rich. And so finally David decided to bring the ark in. So it's quite a story. But you wonder why. I have often wondered, was it really a fair thing, humanly speaking? A man, the Ark of the Covenant is on the wagon, and it rocks, and the man does what would, it's kind of, it was just a natural impulse. Something's going to fall, you try to stop it. So he put his hand out and touched it, and he's dead. I think, well, that seems pretty strict. It's pretty strict, but they weren't supposed to touch it. Only the priests were allowed to touch that, and this was not a priestly man. They finally, David had to send Levites to do it. They finally got smart. At first, they just sent people to do it, and they brought it on a cart. Well, that didn't work very well, so they had to do it. So anyway, as David comes in, you find so much of David's life in here. You look at the outline, and we're not going to go through it all. You can see he defeated the Philistines. He brought the Ark of the Covenant. Now, his desire to build the temple is in here several times. In the 17th chapter, then it goes into the victories of his in war, and then it comes back to his attempt to take a census in the 21st chapter. And it's a kind of a strange thing. I have wondered about that. There's another point that I wonder about. David starts to take a census, and his king the general of his army, Joab, really doesn't want to do it, and he took most of it, but he didn't take all of it. And then God judged the man. God judged David for taking that census. Now, I'm scratching my head saying, well, what's the problem? I don't understand the problem that's there. But apparently God had made known to David that he wasn't supposed to do that. Well, David did it anyway. So that's an interesting story, that census in the 21st chapter. It makes interesting reading, but you wonder, well, why? And Joab was right. Joab, you want a character? Folks, there's another character here. There's so many good characters. Read about Joab and pay attention to him back here. That guy was a scoundrel, but he was right a couple times. He was a scoundrel. He really was. And he was a general. Very interesting man. Very interesting man. I wish I had time to spend on him too. Now, what you find in the 22nd chapter, in the 23rd chapter, and really all the way to the 27th chapter, in fact, from 23 through 27, you find that David made all the arrangements for the temple. Now, we know Solomon's going to build the temple, but if it wasn't for David, a lot of things wouldn't have been done. You'll notice it said, we record down here in our notes, that he appoints the orders for the Levites and the priestly duties, the Levitical priestly duties for the temple. He prepares all sorts of material to build the temple. And he even gave the plans to his son. And then he organized the temple singers, the gatekeepers, the military. And then toward the end, the last two chapters are his final words to Solomon and to Israel. So David did a lot of good things in his life. And, I think the saddest thing about David is he might have been the greatest king, except for Bathsheba. He was a great king, and it's pointed out that he followed the Lord in everything in the New Testament. I don't remember the verse But it says he followed the Lord in everything except in the matter of Bathsheba. What he did in Bathsheba's case it's amazing. David would stoop to that level. If you remember, God charged David with adultery and with murder because David had to make sure that the husband Uriah the Hittite got killed so that he could have her as his wife because she was carrying David's baby. And that was after David tried to get Uriah. He called him home from the battle, from the front. He entertained him and got him drunk and tried to send him home. And he wouldn't go home. Uriah wouldn't go home. He slept on the king's doorstep. He tried it the second night. Uriah still wouldn't go home. He got him drunk again. And so he sent Uriah back, of all things, with instructions to the general Joab to lead in a charge and withdraw from Uriah so he gets killed. So David was guilty of murder. Premeditated first-degree murder. That's why he had so much trouble with his children. That's why he wasn't the most righteous king in the Old Testament of all. Well, now, it ends up, we're going to get to a very important event when we move into the Second Chronicles. We're going to try and gallop through here. David is going to make Solomon, his son, king. And there's kind of an odd situation that occurs because in First Chronicles 28 and 29, one of the things that is there is Solomon told the whole nation, he gathered all the nation together, and he said that Solomon was going to be the king after him. Solomon was going to build the temple. Now, who tried to take the kingship? Adonijah tried to sneak in after David was on the way out. David's on his deathbed. And so did Adonijah know who was supposed to rule, who King David said was going to rule? Well, this makes Adonijah look like a real second-class weasel if he knew this. Now, there is one possibility here, and I suggested, and I wasn't sure about it, but there's one commentary that had an interesting note, and I looked at it and I said, that could be so. But Barnes suggests that the first time that Adonijah got on the throne was actually an event before this event. And First Chronicles 28 and 29, where you find that David is telling a nation that Solomon is going to be the king, that actually followed Adonijah's attempt to take the throne, is what's been suggested. And if you go back and look at what happened back in the first time, the king sent his servants and put Solomon on a mule and took him down and had one of the prophets say that he was king. Well, this time it's going to be a much more grand affair. And so Barnes suggested that the first event was kind of a hurry-up job because of Adonijah, and the second time was after this event. And that would make sense to me. I'm not sure, but if you follow the logic of it all, because you remember it was back earlier that we saw that Adonijah was going to be king, and David was sick and in his bed, and they came and told him about it. So then he didn't even go himself. He sent his servant, and they put Solomon on the king's mule and rode him down, and then they had the priests anoint him, and the prophets, and I think it was Prophet Nathan was there with him, and they anointed him king. But now when you get to in 1 Chronicles 28 and 29, you find that David's not only going to be here, he's announcing that he's going to be king, he's making a big deal out of it, he's giving instructions to Solomon in front of all the people. So it's a much more grand affair, and so I think that might be the case, that the first time was a hurry-up affair because Adonijah tried to take the throne, and he wasn't supposed to. Now that still begs the question that I raised before, did Adonijah know that he wasn't supposed to take the throne? I can't answer that one. I suspect he should have known. He should have known. He was the oldest living, at that time appears he was the oldest living son of King David. He would have been the oldest one because the first three of his brothers, two of them are definitely said to be killed, and the other one is missing by lack of name. He's not ever mentioned. So the oldest one surviving was Adonijah, so he should have known what King David's plans were. And if he may have, I can't say, but after this point, he definitely knew. And what he did afterwards, if you remember the story, we mentioned that Adonijah, after Solomon took the throne, he went to Bathsheba, who, of course, that was Solomon's mother. And, sorry about your pointer. And so he wanted to get the young lady that kept the king warm. Abishag was a young maiden And the king didn't know her. He didn't have any sexual relations with her. She just kept him warm. She lay with him and held him and cuddled him. And so Adonijah wanted her for wife. And Solomon said, "You've spoken that against your own life." And that was the end of Adonijah. Those people, they didn't mess around. And Solomon was pretty smart. He could see where that was going. Really quite a story. So when you get into 2 Chronicles then, now Solomon gets on the throne and he's going to ask God for wisdom. And bless his heart, Solomon did the right thing. He did ask for wisdom. And so 2 Chronicles is going to go all the way down to the final king again. And this is going to be, there's some different details in here when you get to the last kings. And we're not going to go through them all. I have them all listed here, but you can read through them and there's a little bit of information. There are some things that are really fascinating to me that we'll have to share with you. But you can see as you go down through here, you're going to have Rehoboam in here, Solomon, Rehoboam. Solomon starts off, you have Rehoboam, and you go through all the kings. And of course, I started to make a quick and easy chart of the kings and just whether they're good or bad. And I found that I did part of it and I left off the references for it. So I have it here, but I'm going to have to go back and put the references in or else handwrite them in for you, the chapters. But you can see them on here. You can see the kings that are named down through here. And there's a fascinating group of kings in here. Now, there are two kings in particular that are of interest because of something about them. One of the kings, King Amaziah, who was listed as being a righteous king in most charts. Did you know there was something about him that was a little bit unsavory? Let's go to 2 Chronicles 25 for a moment. I apologize if we're going through this so fast, but we can only just do what we have time for. And you can read about these kings, and you can see the story. But here's one that you need to know about, because I don't quite know how to digest this, shall we say. Some of these kings did some really, really strange things they should have done. And in 2 Chronicles 25, Amaziah was listed as a good king. And for the most part, he seemed to be a good king for a time. And let's go down to verse 25th chapter, or about verse 4. Let's see. Verse 11. We'll start at 2 Chronicles 25. This is about Amaziah, and he was supposedly a righteous king, but let's see if he was really that righteous. And Amaziah strengthened himself and led forth his people, and went to the valley of Salt, and smote the children of Seir 10,000. That's Edom. That's the southern. That's the descendants of Esau. And the other 10,000 left alive did the children of Judah carry away captive, and brought them to the top of the rock, and cast them down from the top of the rock, and they were broken in pieces. Doesn't sound very nice there. But all the soldiers of the army which Amaziah sent back, that they should not go with him to the battle, fell upon the cities of Judah, from Samaria into Beth Horon, and smote 3,000 of them, and took the spoil. Now it came to pass after that Amaziah was come from the slaughter of the Edomites, he brought the gods of Seir, and set them up to be his gods, and bowed himself down before them, and burned incense unto them. Wherefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Amaziah, and he sent a prophet unto him, which said, Why have you sought after the gods of the people, which could not deliver their own people out of your hands? Well, and it came to pass, verse 16, as he talked with him, that the king said unto him, Are you the king's counsel? Forbear, why should you be smitten? Then the prophet forbare and said, I know that God is determined to destroy thee, because you've done this. So Amaziah essentially wound up on the short end of things, and he was killed a little bit later. He challenged Joash of the northern kingdom to a battle. Now they had been on good terms, but he challenged him to a fight. And as a result, Joash, you look down in verse 23 of the same chapter, the 25th chapter of 2 Chronicles, Joash, the king of Israel, took Amaziah, the king of Judah, the son of Joash, the son of Jehoahaz, at Bethshemesh, and brought him to Jerusalem, and brake down the wall of Jerusalem from the gate of Ephraim to the gate corner 400 cubits. And he took all the gold and silver and all the vessels found in the house of God with Odobedom, and the treasures of the king house, and the hostages, and returned to Samaria. And Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, lived after the death of Joash, son of Jehoahaz, king of Israel, 15 years. Now, you read down at the end, it says in verse 27, now after that time did Amaziah turn away from following the Lord. They made a conspiracy against him in Jerusalem. He fled to Lachish, and they sent after Lachish, after him and slew him there. And they brought him on horses and buried him in the city of, with his fathers in the city of Judah. So was this man really a righteous king? It's like he did what was right, but we find out it says he did it, but not with a perfect heart, not with a loyal heart. And so it kind of looks like maybe he really shouldn't be considered so much a righteous king, because look what he does here. He decides to worship. And that doesn't sit well with me. Now there's one other king, and of all these kings, I wish I had time to go into them all, but I want you to look over. This one is to me the most astonishing of all the kings in there. You've got to see this one. In 2 Chronicles 33, this is near the end. The one king that I said was the all-time worst king, and he may have been worse than most of the kings of the northern kingdom, was Manasseh. Manasseh was just terrible. And we can read, let's begin reading in verse 1. We'll read a couple verses. Our time is up, but I don't want you to miss this. This is just too fascinating and too important to understand. It says, Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. But he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, like unto the abominations of the heathen. Now, no, it's not. This is not said of any other king. It said he did like the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. For he built again the high places which Hezekiah his father had broken down. Now he would think he would have known better. His father was a righteous, oh boy, and reared up altars for Baalim, and made groves, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served them. And it says, and he built altars in the house of the Lord, where the Lord had said, in Jerusalem my name shall be forever. And he built altars for all the host of heaven, and in 2 courts of the house of the Lord. No, nobody else ever did anything like this that I'm aware of. He has altars for pagan deities in the temple of the Lord. And, verse 6, he caused his children to pass through the fire in the valley of Hinnom. He also observed times. Now, pass through the fire in the valley of Hinnom. What does that mean, pass through the fire? You know what that means? It means human sacrifice. It means he sacrificed some of his children to a pagan deity. That is about as low as you can get. That is exactly what was going on in the land. That's why it says he did what the heathen did. But now here's something that really strikes me. Look at verse 9 of the 33rd chapter. So Manasseh made Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to err, and do worse than the heathen, whom the Lord, you see that? Worse than the heathen, whom the Lord had destroyed before Israel. And the Lord spake unto Manasseh and unto his people, but they would not hearken. Now this is something you won't find anywhere else in the Old Testament, and this is really stunning to me. Wherefore the Lord brought upon him the captains of the host of Assyria, which took Manasseh among the thorns, and took him among the thorns, which I guess he was out of the castle, and bound him with fetters, and carried him to Babylon. And when he was in affliction, he besought the Lord his God. And humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers, and prayed unto him, and he was entreated of him, and heard his supplication, and brought him again to Jerusalem into his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew the Lord he was God. But it was probably too late by that point. So this is one of those events that you would not have ever imagined happened. And when I read this the first time years back, when I started reading the Bible all the time, and you go on from here. Look what it says in verse 15. He took away the strange god and the idols out of the house of the Lord, and all the altars he built in the house of the Lord, and Jerusalem cast them out of the city. He repaired the altar of the Lord, and sacrificed thereon peace offerings and thank offerings, and commanded Judah to serve the Lord God of Israel. If he'd have only done that about 50 years earlier, if he'd only done that. So, really strange story. I mean, it's strange and it's sad. He finally realizes at the very end, after it's too late, after he's brought on his descendants after him, there's not going to be any decent kings except for Josiah, and he only lived 31 years. This man brought the whole house down. But the sad thing is, he actually did learn. And notice back here, if words mean anything, it says, he besought, verse 12, and when he was in affliction, he besought the Lord, whose God? His God. Apparently this man was a believer, and yet he did all these other things? How could he do those other things? I can't explain any of this. Maybe he became a believer while he was sitting there in the jailhouse. That would be a more likely thing. But his father was Hezekiah. And remember what it said about Hezekiah? There was no one like him before him or after him. That was his dad. Maybe it finally got through to him. What a terrible way to have to learn. That might be, in the whole book of 2 Chronicles, I think that's probably the saddest part of everything. And all the drama we've seen, that's the saddest thing in here. This man learned a little bit too late. Just a little bit too late. That's something. So, the story of the kings. Well, I'll try to remember and finish this thing. I started this sheet and I put on here, I could let you have them, except that I didn't write the references down after some of them, so I'll get them for next week. And it just basically, I put on here whether the kings are righteous or evil, the southern kingdom. But when you look at it, it's really quite a story. And you begin to understand, this is why God judged these people. They only had a few good kings, and even some of the ones that were supposedly good were maybe not that good after all. And there's more that we could say. I wish I had time to go into some more of the kings, but we'll stop here. And are there questions that we can answer tonight? Anybody have questions? We had a lot of interesting stuff we've covered, and a lot we didn't have time to cover, I'm sorry to say.